Thunderblade is one of those mid to late 1980s Sega arcade games that gets a bad rap. Like many of its brethren, this was because the home systems at the time weren't nearly powerful enough for faithful arcade ports. But while Afterburner, Space Harrier and even Galaxy Force reaped the benefits of re-release on 30-bit and later platforms, Thunderblade didn't quite get the same treatment. It's a shame, of course, because the original 1987 arcade game is actually pretty cool. The concept was obviously born from one of Sega's developers catching Roy Schneider's Blue Thunder on TV late one night and decided to make a video game loosely based on helicopter shooting stuff. I mean, the title screen is even a digitised still from the movie. Now, the arcade game runs on a classic Sega X board and uses Sega's popular super scaler technique for some pretty impressive effects. There are also two distinct camera angles, an overhead and an over-the-shoulder viewpoint. I remember the game being released as a stand-up arcade cabinet with force feedback as the joystick vibrates. But if you're wanting a really good experience, then there was the helicopter-shaped sit-down model, which was released replacing the force feedback with a cockpit seat that moves in tandem with the joystick. It's basically a motion simulator cabinet like the previous Sega Super Scaler games such as Space Harrier and Afterburner. Brilliant games, and I have to say, Sega really were top of their game at this particular time. In the game, the player controls a helicopter gunship using its chain gun and missiles to destroy enemy tanks, helicopters and other vehicles and structures to save their home country. The player is given 2 lives as continues, used if they are killed in a level, and clearing a level allows the player to return, bypassing the levels before it. The overhead sequences are impressive, since your helicopter is angled towards the ground and the view is slightly tilted, which was quite unique. Your arsenal includes both a machine gun and missiles, both of which have unlimited ammo. The only difference is their attack range. In addition to moving left and right, you can also raise or lower your altitude, scaling the ground back and forth with some impressively smooth animation. Just watching it in action is incredibly cool, especially after you've been shot down and take off back into the skies. The helicopter has constant momentum going forward, although technically you can't move forwards and backwards within the visible playing field. You can alter your speed, which includes a super fast turbo mode. There are a number of cool effects at work here. Other Sega Super Scaler games like Outrun pulled off a bit of visual trickery by layering several identical tiles one after another, each positioned and scaled slightly different from the last. This gave the impression of a solid object like, say, a canyon wall. Obviously, the technique looks a bit cheesy in retrospect, but it's remarkable for the time. And due to its unique perspective, Thunderblade does something different. Because the buildings and mountains found throughout the game are all layered tiles, but each tile moves at a different speed as you fly past, which gives the illusion of depth in a strictly 2D game without any fancy use of polygons. It's pretty clever. A distance meter highlights your progress throughout the level, and partway through the stage the viewpoint changes to a more familiar over-the-shoulder perspective. I suppose they're pretty much like the bonus stages of Afterburner in that it's possible to crash into the scenery if you're not careful. Here the machine gun is used to take out airborne targets while missiles travel along the ground. And when you reach the end, the perspective once again switches to an overhead view, except now you can't change your altitude. Your goal is to conduct a bombing run on a gigantic tank and or jet, taking apart its turrets piece by piece. The only exception is the final stage, which ends in the over-the-shoulder perspective against a different variety of gigantic tank. Thunderblade is a short game with only 4 rounds, consisting of flights through a city, the wilderness, a canyon and an oil refinery. I suppose it's pretty standard stuff, but like most Sega games of the era, the brightly coloured pixel art is attractive, and it cannot be overemphasised that the scaling still looks incredible, even decades later. The music is appropriate 1980s action fare with a significant if not overwhelming amount of cowbell. It's rather unmemorable since the explosions tend to drown it out, but it works well enough. Of course, like many other Sega games, the big draw of the arcade version was the sit-down arcade cabinet. The home versions just don't have quite the same appeal. And we're going to look at those just in a second. Now, in Japan, Game Machine listed Thunderblade as the fourth most successful upright arcade unit of January 1988. And it also went on to become Japan's ninth highest grossing dedicated arcade game of 1988 too. And finally, the arcade game was well received by critics. Computer and Video Games called it a helicopter simulation with several innovative features, and they went on to say it was a brilliant game with superb graphics and gameplay. Okay, so let's look at the ports of Thunderblade, starting off with the 8-bit home computer versions, which were released between 1988 and 1989. Now, I have to say, most of these computer ports are actually notably impressive, because they actually contain the scaling in the overhead stages, which the console ports never really bothered with. They're obviously not quite as smooth, and the tiles aren't as detailed. They're usually just a single colour or two, depending on the version. But it's not bad, despite the huge border at the top of the screen, so let's start by looking at the Amstrad CPC version. The colours and 3D effects of the Amstrad CPC version would have been considered pretty good for back in the day, but I'm afraid to say that this is the slowest version and it's quite choppy and laggy. The frame rate significantly drops a lot when there's a lot going on the screen. I'm not sure if this is down to poor programming or just that the hardware cannot cope with the game. But certainly, all in all, it does make the game a little unbearable to play. Sure, it looks okay, but it plays poorly. It's certainly the weakest of the bunch. Next up is the ZX Spectrum version. Although the ZX Spectrum version is monochrome and choppy, it does play pretty well. In fact, it earned the game a Crash Smash Award from the popular Crash magazine. And I have to say, I did like both the overhead and third-person perspective angles in this game. And I have to say, the sound effects are pretty okay too, better than the usual bips and farts that some of the Specky games give off. However, in saying all that, I did perhaps find the game just a little bit difficult as I kept getting destroyed with the continual bullets and rockets being fired at me. So I would say that the game can be a bit tricky and a little bit challenging to get through. But overall, a pretty good Specky game. Now, not much to say about the MSX version, it's just really a quick port of the ZX Spectrum version. It has the monochrome and slow frame rate, but it does play pretty good and it plays better than that Amstrad CPC version. Although I would say that the ZX Spectrum was slightly better, but overall it does have that arcade vibe about it, a pretty reasonable achievement for the MSX hardware. Okay, next up is the Commodore 64 version, and I have to say, despite being one of the worst looking of the bunch, it does handle fairly well, and it's a fairly faithful version of the arcade game. The scrolling is pretty decent in this version, it's pretty smooth, and I was actually quite impressed with what the Commodore 64 managed to pull off here. So far, I would say that this is actually the better game. It's better than the ZX Spectrum, MSX, and certainly that Amstrad CPC version. Alright, now we're on to the IBM PC version. Firstly, the IBM PC release has some notably downgraded visuals. The graphics are a bit blocky and a bit flat. It just doesn't quite have that 3D feel of the other versions of the game. And the sound effects in this MS-DOS game is not really good either. However, the key problem lies with the controls, where you need to adjust your speed manually, otherwise you just hover in mid-air. But when you do get used to the controls, I suppose it is playable, and it's not overly difficult to complete, which I suppose is a positive point. Both the Amiga and the Atari ST versions look pretty good, but that's much to be expected for 16-bit systems. The Amiga version does look slightly better, and it certainly plays much smoother than the Atari ST version. But I have to say, I was very frustrated with the Amiga version. Because in this version, you need to hold down the fire button and press up to increase speed, and then press down to take off. And I have to say, I did get frustrated with these controls, and I did get killed a lot, and I just found it too challenging just to get through the first level. If only they sorted out these controls, this would have been a very good game, so for that reason I was a little bit frustrated with the Amiga game. It could have been much better. Okay, here's the Atari ST version. Although the Atari ST version does visually look okay, looks pretty good, similar to the Amiga version, maybe not quite as good, I just found it slightly let down with the frame rate dropping all the time. In fact, it was difficult to stay with the game because it was just so slow and laggy, and for that reason it's not actually as good as the Amiga version. Now we're on to the Sega Master System version. In regards to the Master System port, well, it doesn't come even close and doesn't even try for the most part. The overhead scenes have been changed entirely to 3D without the ability to change altitude or alter your speed, while all of the 3D effects have been totally removed. As such, it feels like a really standard, really boring shooter, especially since your firepower is so weak and there aren't any extra weapons. And strangely, most of the helicopters you fight don't fire any guns, and they're content to fly in the same handful of formations, ramming straight through your copter in countless kamikaze attacks. The over-the-shoulder segments aren't much better either. Naturally, they're pretty choppy, but the first stage is remarkably boring because half the enemies can't even damage you. They're just there for target practice. It gets more difficult by the second stage, where the choppy scrolling makes flying through the cave and manoeuvring quite difficult. The levels are essentially the same as the arcade game, although the order of the bosses have been changed. The only positive aspect is the image of the burning wrecked helicopter when you lose all your lives. Otherwise, it's a total wash. Interestingly enough, the Japanese version uses a few different sound effects to the American European version, which I have to say is a little less harsh in the ears. Overall for me, it's just an average game. It's okay, but, well, no, it's a bit boring actually. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Sega Genesis version, and I have to say this is perhaps more considered of a sequel to the game rather than a direct port of the arcade game. But nevertheless, I wanted to put it in our video, so let's have a look. So the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive version was released around the launch of the system, and it's called Super Thunderblade. despite there being nothing super about it. I mean, the first overhead section of each level has been cut out entirely. Instead, each stage starts off in the over-the-shoulder segment. I suppose to make up for this, these stages are longer and have a new mid-boss similar to the one fought at the end of the arcade version. After defeating this, you go into an overhead view, but there's no scaling at all. Once again, there are only 4 stages, with the first, second and fourth being roughly identical to the arcade game, and the third being a brand new level that takes place over the ocean. There's also a new final boss fought in the overhead perspective. I also noticed that the targeting in this game has been simplified, as the missiles now home in on the enemies. Regrettably, the hardware still chokes in the game. The 3D scrolling is better than any of the other ports we've seen, save the X68000 version, which we're going to look at, but it's still a far cry from the arcade game. The multi-layered buildings are now just a single layer, and some areas look embarrassingly bad, like the caverns in the second stage. And additionally, there's a split second of lag before every movement, which makes manoeuvring through anything a massive bout of frustration. You can stop and hover, but otherwise you can't change speed. So for me, it's not a very good port, this game. Okay, now we're on to the Sharp X68000 version. And this game was ported by SPS and published by Sharp in 1990. And I have to say, it's close to arcade perfect, though the sprites are smaller and less numerous. It looks good, it runs and scrolls at a smooth frame rate, and overall plays just like the arcade game. It's a pretty good game, really. I suppose the only downfall is that this game was only released in Japan, so therefore us Western gamers had to do with one of the many conversions published by US Gold. The PC Engine version ported by NEC Avenue actually keeps all of the overhead sections. It removes the scaling, but as a compromise allows the helicopter to move up and down the screen, which you couldn't do in the Genesis Super Thunderblade game. Sure, the scrolling is slow and choppy, but for me it's better than just hacking out these segments altogether. The animation in the over-the-shoulder stages are smoother than the Master System version, but not quite as good as Super Thunderblade. And I did like the fact that this game did have the distance meter present, which wasn't present in the other console versions, but in saying all that, you still can't change your speed. All things considered, it's a better port than any of the Sega's own attempts, though that's not really saying much. And finally, my favourite of them all is the Nintendo 3DS. This 2014 3DS port is the only one to do the arcade game justice, with the usual widescreen and 3D enhancements. Also new is a special mode with rebalanced gameplay, altered levels, boss introduction text, an extra level featuring a new final boss based on the Grantonoff Flying Fortress taken from the Sega Master System version of Afterburner. That's a nice touch. So there you go folks, that was my video covering Thunderblade and all its associated ports. Thank you so much for watching my video, it's very much appreciated. Now, remember to leave a comment. Have you played any of these games? And if so, what's your thoughts? Please let me know, I am very interested. And finally, don't forget to like my video. And obviously, it would be very good, it would be great in fact if you could subscribe to my channel. So, until the next time, take care of yourselves, bye bye.